The Denver Broncos and Bo Nix are ready to make claim in 2025 for the AFC West crown, and we'll tell you how they can do it here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening, Broncos Country? Welcome into another episode, Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where you know it's your team every day. Thank you so much to all the everydayers out there in Broncos Country. Thanks for tuning in, making us your first listen, however you choose to do so. And if you're not yet an everydayer, become one. Hit that subscribe or that follow button wherever you get your podcast so you never miss out on all your Broncos news, content, coverage, analysis, and more every single day, all year long. I'm Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports, where you can check out my written work daily over there at milehighsports.com.
And I'm Sayre Bedinger, site expert at predominantlyorange.com, where you can find my written work every day as well.
And here's what you're going to get on today's episode of the show. Broncos Country, it's great to be back. The Broncos, we're taking a look at the AFC West outlook here and why the Broncos and Bo Nix are ready to make claim for the AFC West crown in 2025. We'll talk about how the Broncos and why they are still ahead of the Las Vegas Raiders in the climb inside the West. And we'll also tell you how the Broncos can get past the Chargers and Justin Herbert here in 2025 after being swept by them last season. And we'll tell you everything that the Broncos need to do to knock off the Kansas City Chiefs to reclaim the AFC West throne, which they haven't held since 2015. You're going to get all that on today's episode of the show. And Sayre, let's start off by talking about probably one of the more heated rivalries in NFL history, and that is the Denver Broncos against the Las Vegas Raiders. And I see a lot of conversation. I feel like this is one of those dynamics you're going to see between the two fan bases. The Raiders over the last handful of years have had the Broncos number, except last year it was when Bo Nix came in and turned the tide. The Broncos swept the Raiders after losing, 8 straight games against Vegas at that point. The last time the Broncos had beaten them before last year was when they were still called the Oakland Raiders. So at that point, Denver was kind of in the basement a little bit. But I think the Broncos have garnered traction. Last year, they obviously jumped ahead of the Raiders in a big way, swept them. And I still think even with their additions of Pete Carroll and Geno Smith, I'm a firm believer that the Broncos are still ahead of the Raiders, and that move isn't going to mean much.
Yeah, I think so too. I think the Raiders did get better offensively this offseason. There's no question about it. You bring in Geno Smith. Obviously, your team is going to take on a completely different philosophy with Pete Carroll now being the head coach. And so you do feel like the Raiders upgraded pretty significantly in that area this offseason. But the longevity of it, I guess that doesn't necessarily matter for this season in particular. But Cody, I think really where this Raiders team is going to struggle is defensively. Now, again, this time of year is everybody's in the best shape of their life. Every team and every fan base is as optimistic as you're going to see throughout the course of the offseason. So right now, Raiders fans are probably feeling like, man, they've got a good chance to see the best in the guys that they've added. But they lost so much defensively, and I don't think they really got any better. Actually, I think they got quite a bit worse, especially in the secondary, where they replaced Nate Hobbs with Eric Stokes. And I mean, he was a bust in Green Bay. You lose Trayvon Merrick and replace him with a Jeremy Chin. I don't know. I don't understand the philosophy in what they were doing defensively. I get the kind of money ball aspect of it, but just feels like the Raiders kind of failed with all the salary cap space that they had. They didn't do a good job in free agency defensively, in my opinion. And I think that's what's going to really burn them over the course of the long haul this season.
Well, and look, they locked up Max Crosby to a long-term extension. They made him at one point the highest paid outside, pass rusher there, in the NFL. And look, he has been the boogeyman for the Broncos. He's always had success, whether, even in the games, like even the first game last year where the Broncos went on a run, Max Crosby was talking smack to Bo Nix, and then Bo and the Broncos go on this big run. They win big in week 5 there. But the competitive nature there. I do think that their main idea, and obviously, I've listened to Locked On Raiders a few times to just catch up on, what your boy Q or our boy Q has been saying about the Raiders as we were getting ready to do this show. And, really the vibe so far for the Raiders offseason, granted, like I said, there's no pads, but Geno Smith has been picked off quite a bit by the Raiders defense and a lot of their new additions. But here's the storyline I find to be a little interesting here as to what will define, I think, this narrative in this matchup. I think the Raiders will actually be a little more stout defensively based on that money ball approach. Like I said, I think them adding Jermaine Pratt was an upgraded inside linebacker. And obviously Pratt intercepted Bo Nix last year, but not going based on that. I think they improved there. But Pete Carroll is looking to bring in a certain archetype of guys to that defense. They've got a dog already on that first level there with Max Crosby. Tyree Wilson, is also an impressive young player that's developing at this point. And I know at the interior tackle position defensively, they were hoping to get some guys back healthy. But linebacker, the secondary, I agree. They questionable moves at this point. Jeremy Chin at one point was a player I think everybody was excited about. I know we initially wanted the Broncos to draft him several years ago, but fizzles out a little bit in Carolina, and then isn't that big name that we saw have that potential developmental path. So for me, the narrative about Denver versus the Raiders in 2025, I think it starts with Bo Nix versus Geno Smith quarterback play. And I have seen people say that they got Geno Smith ranked ahead of Bo Nix in QB rankings. I don't buy into that. I thought Bo Nix had an incredibly better season than Geno Smith last year. But that narrative is just a little interesting to me that like Geno above Bo, like the Broncos have the fourth best quarterback in the AFC West. I'm like, Geno? You based on Geno? Come on, man.
Yeah, I like Geno Smith, Cody, but I'm not one of those types of people that's like trying to overrate him. I think that a lot of times when a guy is able to bounce back in his career some way or another, I mean, we see it, pretty consistently these days that certain guys are getting overrated based on, one season or whatever it may be. I think Geno, his bounce back year with the Seahawks back in 2022 or 2023, what was it? 2022 when they traded Russell Wilson to Denver.
Yeah.
Feels like a lifetime ago at this point. But when he had that big year that year, I think everybody's kind of basing their opinions on him based on that. And now, he's entering his, mid 30s, and he's getting to that point to where now it's a change of scenery. You're no longer in a situation where you've got DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett and Jackson Smith and Jigba and Noah Fant and all these other players, like the running backs that they have, Kenneth Walker, Zach Charbonnet. Like Seattle had some really good players in their skill positions that were bailing out really good throws by Geno Smith, but you're not always going to have that. And I know Jacoby Myers is sure-handed, and Brock Bowers, one of the best skill players in the league. They've got pieces there. Like I said, they're going to be better offensively. They've raised the floor, but I don't buy the idea that Geno is – I don't think he's better now nor long-term than Bo Nix. And I think that that's a reasonable take. Like, Geno has proven more since 2022 than Bo Nix. Bo's only got 1 year in the NFL. But when you talk about rankings and we talk about projecting, you have to do a little projecting, right? You have to sort of say what you think is going to happen, not just based on, well, Geno's been doing this for 3 years now. I think that he's I don't think he's necessarily on a decline, Cody, but I think going into a new situation with less talent at receiver than he's had before, I think it could be a tough situation for him to step into.
Well, it seems like as well, the idea here with them drafting Ashton Jeanty in round one, a guy the Broncos wanted, the idea that I see here is that they want to have a smothering defense and they want to be able to run the ball, and they want someone like Geno to be able to manage the game, which Geno could be a game manager. How good is he going to be with all the pieces around him? I don't know. You mentioned Brock Bowers, Jacoby Myers. I know they drafted several wide receivers as well to try to boost that room here. But to me, the idea is they're going to be a run-dominant team. They're going to try, like Pete Carroll looks like he's going to be trying to replicate what happened a little bit. You want to have a really good defense, which he had plenty, with the Legion of Boom back in the day. And, he thinks that maybe Ashton Jeanty could be the next, that Marshawn Lynch factor where he's just a dominant runner. Jeanty, we're excited to see what that challenge is going to be like here for the Broncos, because they're going to have to go out there and stop it. But you have the eraser and Patrick Surtain, who obviously was probably the only corner last year who limited anything that Brock Bowers was able to do when covering him. So that's a great piece right there. And obviously with the additions the Broncos made in the draft at secondary, bringing in Talanoa Hufanga alongside Brandon Jones, I think that the Broncos have a better overall roster right now. Not to overlook the Raiders. I'm never going to be one of those guys that overlooks a team here, but I think that the Broncos are on a better upward trajectory right now, especially after the Raiders decided to extend Geno Smith in Vegas before having him even play it down, knowing that they might have questions at quarterback long-term. So that to me is going to be an interesting dynamic to watch here. Broncos Country, want to know your thoughts on the state of the Las Vegas Raiders, their offseason, how it stacks up to the Denver Broncos, or whether or not you believe that the Broncos are still ahead of the Raiders going into 2025. But we're not done yet, Broncos Country. Still a lot of conversation here on the AFC West to be had, and we're going to tell you how the Broncos can get past Justin Herbert and the Los Angeles Chargers in 2025 here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos.
Today's episode of Locked On Broncos is brought to you by Monarch Money. Do you ever check your bank account and wonder, where did all my money go, right? Between dining out, online shopping, and entertainment, we've all been there, and it's easy to lose track, right? And that's where Monarch Money comes in. It's your personal CFO giving you full visibility and control over your finances. And Monarch Money isn't just a budgeting app, right? It's a complete financial command center where you can track all your accounts, your investments, and all your spending in one place. So you stop just managing your money and you start building wealth.
Well, and I think that's important, Sarah, because you want that all-in-one convenience, and Monarch Money provides that. Instead of juggling multiple apps like I do, you can use Monarch to check your finances, track your spending, and even plan your long-term financial goals. So take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDON NFL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDON NFL for half off your first year.
The Denver Broncos came up short from trying to jump the Los Angeles Chargers in 2024, but we think that they can finally do it here in 2025. We're going to give you some reasons why on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. But Broncos Country, thanks so much for tuning in today, making us your first listen of the day every single day. Cody, the Broncos had an 11-point lead the last time they played the Chargers, and it went into the third quarter. It was one of the most devastating losses of the season. Kind of felt like it was maybe going to cost the Broncos their shot at the playoffs, at getting back into the postseason for the first time since Super Bowl 50. Typically, even as bad as the Broncos have been, they've been splitting with the Los Angeles Chargers year after year. They've kind of had Justin Herbert's number up until this past year, which is ironic because this was the best defense the Broncos have had in a really long time. And arguably, this was the worst group of receivers Justin Herbert has had since he's been with the Chargers. So I'm interested to know your thoughts on this. Do you feel like the Broncos can jump the Chargers here finally? They were only one game off last year, right? So they've got they're really close, and they had a second half lead against them last year. I'm interested to know your thoughts. Do you think the Broncos can jump this team in 2025?
I think they can, but the issue here and what we saw from them last year against the Chargers, they got off to a slow start in that first game, right? Obviously, the first offensive series for the Chargers against Denver's defense, Pat Surtain goes down with a concussion. So he's pulled out of the game at that point. And then they had J.K. Dobbins. They had an effective run game that really got them a 20-0 lead at halftime against Denver. The Broncos, obviously, they buckled down in the second half. They had that comeback. They almost pulled it out, right? But like in the Fast and Furious, it was like, dude, I almost had you. He's like, you almost had me. You didn't have your own car. The idea of that is like, all right, hey, Denver's got to find a way to avoid getting put in that slump early on, right? And there was a turnover early on there. Bo Nix, a pass went off once again, the hands of a wide receiver tipped, and it was intercepted on their first drive there. And it's like, all right, no momentum there. That second game, that Thursday night football game, we saw the Broncos come out, and they just got off to such a hot start there early on, right? But then you have that little flubber at the end of the first half that led to the free kick, field goal. And then that kind of, we talk about momentum. I know Sean Payton downplayed and said that didn't really impact our momentum in any way, shape, or form. I think for the overall perception, the feel of the game, I think we felt like it did. You had that 11-point lead in the second half, and you just couldn't find a way to get a stop. Ladd McConkey really carved up the Broncos there. There were a couple of big busted plays because of coverage, and that was part of that dynamic that we talked about as to why the Broncos went out this offseason. They addressed and they added Drake Greenlaw at inside linebacker. They added Talanoa Hufanga at the safety position. They believe that those guys can be the neutralizers against what other teams are going to do for them. And obviously, they added Jahdae Barron in the NFL draft to be able to counter that. You need to be able to do that. Mike Williams is back with the Chargers. And obviously, I think, he's not the same guy he used to be, but he's still a guy you can't overlook here. Obviously, you talk about Ladd McConkey in the slot. They're trying to get better at the tight end position as well. But then the idea is they've added Najee Harris. They have Omari and Hampton. And knowing how Harbaugh runs his teams, it seems like this is going to be a run-heavy offense with Najee Harris, with Omari and Hampton, kind of that smash and dash combo. That's what they're hoping it can be. And then they believe that they have, those guys that can create separation there and make plays downfield and passing game off of play action. They're going to be a challenge. In my opinion, we're going to talk about Kansas City here in a second. But in my opinion, I feel like the toughest team right now in the AFC West, for the Broncos' perspective, I feel like will be the Chargers.
Yeah, it just feels like they have high floors in pretty much every area of their team right now. Even with some of the, I think I don't know that they necessarily upgraded a ton on defense. You know, Joey Bosa, I don't think that's like, it's almost like you can't miss what you never had, right? The guy barely ever played for them and was obviously an impact player when on the field, but how much are you really losing there? And then you look at their secondary this year. Obviously, they bring in Dante Jackson into the cornerback mix. And so I don't know. I look at that defense, Cody, and to me, I'm kind of like, okay, they were really good last year. Did they get better? And the loss of Poona Ford is actually quite a big one. I mean, literally on the interior, he's just a guy who takes up a ton of space, helped their run defense a lot last year. Losing him will hurt, but offensively, you feel like they got quite a bit better with the additions of Omarion Hampton, Najee Harris at running back, Mekhi Becton, I think one of the most underrated pickups in the AFC West this year to go next to Joe Alt on the right side of that line. So
Super Bowl champion.
Super Bowl champion. That's right. Absolutely. And he kind of resurrected his career under Jeff Stoutland, the O-line coach there with the Philadelphia Eagles. Really, really good development for him at guard. And to have him next to Joe Alt, it's kind of a scary proposition. Thankfully, the Broncos are deep on the D-line. And then I also really like the Trey Harris pick for them, Cody. I mean, he had 1,000 yards last season on the lowest number of targets for any receiver at the college level that eclipsed 1,000 yards. He had the lowest number of targets to get there. So maximizing his touches is what that equals to and amounts to. So I hate to say that I like what the Chargers did this offseason. I think Jim Harbaugh brought in guys who fit what he does well, and they've just raised the bar overall. Now, the biggest win I think the Broncos have had is getting Evan Ingram instead of the Chargers getting him. Because imagine if the tables were turned there, that would be disastrous. It's good to know the Chargers didn't get that guy and that the Broncos are going to be able to neutralize, I think, what Ladd McConkey brings to the table with their upgrades in the secondary.
Yeah, and I think the idea here too is, can the Broncos maybe unleash a little bit of that? I don't know. I don't want to say animosity, because I don't think that's where J.K. Dobbins is at. But can J.K. Dobbins be an effective weapon against his old team? I think that's going to be a dynamic to watch. Whereas I think the idea here is Denver's going to be able to run the football, and offensively, we've talked about that being a key for them to take the next step there, take the pressure off of Bo Nix, because Bo, we know, can play. Bo can ball, but Bo can be even better if you have the threat of a consistent run game there. That's where I think the Broncos, if they can establish that, especially against a team like the Chargers, the way they had, because it was going in the first half, I believe they had like 13 carries for 89 yards in the first half of that Thursday night football game. And then I think they only had 20 yards in the second half, if I'm not mistaken. That's not good enough, especially when you have a lead. You want to be able to play ball-controlled defense and still be able to run the ball effectively on offense, because you do that, you take away opportunities from the offense, the opposing offense, to be on the field, while you also just run the clock down. The Broncos' time and game management last year in that aspect, that can be better this year. I agree with you. I think that this is going to be probably the matchup in the AFC West that will define the division, I think, because look, everyone talks about the Chargers versus Kansas City. I understand the appeal there, because Herbert versus Mahomes. I think that this is going to be the one that's everyone's going to have their eyes on. And I imagine when we look at this upcoming season, we're going to go back and we're going to say, okay, hey, these games came at crucial junctures. Can the Broncos, especially early on in the season, can they get a win against the Chargers? That will, I think, set the tone here, because we talked about the amount of AFC games that the Broncos have to play in the first half of the schedule. Take care of your conference play, and better yet, take care of your division. You do that early on, you take pressure off yourself down the season. And I don't know if you want to have that pressure there. I think that a Harbaugh-led team is going to be the most dangerous aspect here for the Broncos' goals to win here in the AFC West. And I think they've made some moves that have kind of strengthened them a little bit. We'll see if the Broncos can rise up to the occasion here against this Chargers team.
Yeah, the Broncos last year against the Chargers, it felt like they really struggled on third downs, specifically on both sides of the ball. The Broncos converting offensively and then getting off the field defensively against the Chargers was one of the most difficult tasks, I think, of the whole season. I don't remember, Cody, a quarterback being on more of a heater than Justin Herbert on third downs against the Broncos. It felt like the guy was just able to play YOLO ball out there when the Broncos were playing against both games against the Chargers last season. And so that, to me, is that area where we talk about, okay, you can talk about paper moves all you want, adding Ingram, losing this guy, adding this guy. You can talk about that all you want. Ultimately, have the Broncos done enough to improve their third down chances against the Chargers? I think they absolutely have, with the additions of Dre Greenlaw, Talanoa Hufanga, Jade Barron. Those are guys that can neutralize some of those weapons. The Chargers had too many, what did Sean Payton call it, free runners on third down last season, and just guys running wide open. I don't think that's going to happen this coming season, at least as often, right? I mean, we can't guarantee anything in June, but certainly that's the area that I think the Broncos need to improve the most against LA.
Broncos Country, we want to hear from you. What do you think the Broncos need to do to best position themselves to beat the Chargers here this upcoming season, to lay claim to the AFC West? Make sure you let us know here on today's episode of the show. But coming up next, we're going to talk about how the Broncos can finally knock off Patrick Mahomes and the Kansas City Chiefs here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. It's been 84 years. That's how it feels for the Broncos in terms of winning the AFC West. The Kansas City Chiefs have dominated the division ever since. And now the Broncos, their offseason, they're poised to make a move here to reclaim their stake with the AFC West crown in 2025. But they're going to have to get through the Raiders. They're going to have to get through Justin Herbert and the Chargers. And more importantly, they're going to have to knock off Patrick Mahomes and the Kansas City Chiefs. We'll tell you how they can do that here in today's episode of the show. Real quick, I want to say thanks once again to everyone in Broncos Country. Thanks for tuning in, making us your first listen, however you choose to do so. Sayre, look, we talked about it just a few weeks ago. Our good friends over at the Locked On NFL Scouting Podcast with the Draft Dudes, they put out a list of all of the teams that they felt like improved their roster the most. And I know we vehemently disagreed with them having Kansas City above Denver. I'm still on the board of that by saying, what did the Chiefs do exactly in this offseason that made them improve their roster the most, considering they lost a couple of their key players like Joe Thuney, Justin Reed, and you have questions like, you have a young offensive tackle now. Can that wide receiver room stay healthy or out of trouble is another question there. To me, the Broncos are best positioned right now to knock off Kansas City, more so than they ever have been in the last, I'd say, 8 or 9 years.
Yeah, it really felt like, oddly enough, that loss on Thursday Night Football back in Sean Payton's first year with the team, it felt like that was sort of a turning point for the Broncos against the Chiefs. Even though they lost that game, they really proved like, okay, even with arguably the worst defense that we've had, that was coming off the heels of that Miami game, if memory serves me right, Cody. And then they went in and they played really great against Patrick Mahomes. I felt like that was a turning point for this team. And that Sean Payton has that extra chip on his shoulder going up against Kansas City, because I think he wants to prove that, okay, with 90 million in dead cap, we can come into your house and beat you. And just straight up, the Broncos, I mean, all but the final kick, they did. They straight up beat the Chiefs. They played better than the Chiefs that day for all but one play. And I think that, you know what, Kansas City fans get into our mentions all the time when we bring that up, that Bo Nix should have won his first time going to Kansas City. And to me, I don't think it has anything to do with moves necessarily on paper, Cody. I just feel like the Broncos have proven, like, man, they're just more talented than this Kansas City roster, just straight up. I think that's, I don't think there's any question about that. The only issue is that Kansas City is just inevitable. They everything that they do, they force teams into this sort of weird Bermuda Triangle where everything that can go wrong will go wrong. And it happens every single game that they play. I don't understand it. Teams make mistakes at the worst time. Just ask the Raiders on what was that, Thanksgiving last year. I mean, that's just kind of how it feels for the Chiefs. Like, whatever happens in the offseason happens. It's just a matter of, can you get out of your own way when you're playing this team?
Yeah, and that's the thing is, Kansas City will capitalize on that. I think their experience factor that they have there, obviously with Mahomes, obviously with Andy Reid, Chris Jones. I mean, this is a team that's got some solidified pillars there that, know how to play in the big games. And granted, Kansas City, they're going to have a big chip on their shoulder here this year because, look, despite all the nerves, like last year, everybody, I would say, was rooting for the downfall of the Chiefs, which certainly we were. We were saying, hey, it fall off the mountain a little bit. If we had to choose anyone to win in the Super Bowl, we were rooting for the Eagles to win just because of that. Because it's like, hey, can you force the Eagles to blow, can the Eagles force the Chiefs to blow some things up here a little bit? Now, obviously, that's the dynamic. When you have the highest paid quarterback in the NFL, like Patrick Mahomes, and obviously Josh Allen came in and had something to say about that afterwards. But when you make those moves and you have some young pieces around you, Travis Kelce's getting older, you're really trying to figure out how can the Chiefs capture this feeling? How can they hold on to that? How can they sustain that? It's hard, but man, that experience factor is something that has made a tremendous difference for them. They're coming into the season after that Super Bowl loss, which was embarrassing and demoralizing for them. They're going to be a little bit chippy this upcoming season. And I think all signs kind of point to, could this be Travis Kelce's last run here in the NFL? There's been a lot of talk about that because he decided to run it back while mulling retirement initially after the Super Bowl loss. This feels like they're going to try to go for this, hey, one more ride, that the same mantra that we saw back in the day with the Chicago Bulls and Michael Jordan. So that's where I think that they can be dangerous here. But I think if the Broncos can knock off the Kansas City Chiefs, Denver has to be better overall this season in one category, Sayre, and that is taking care of business in one-score games. That was the demoralizing factor for them last year. You talked about in yesterday's episode show how the Broncos, were they 1-6 in one-score games last season? But then all the other games, 9 out of the 10 wins that they had, they won by double digits, or by nine or more points at that juncture. So for me, it's not a question of can the Broncos do it? It's can they find a way to be sustainable? That is the idea here. And I think so much of that is when we look at this Broncos team against Kansas City going into Arrowhead, what was the storyline defensively? Really for the Chiefs, it was Patrick Mahomes making some plays on third down. Nick Bonito had a couple of wrap-ups, what should have been sacks, and somehow Patrick Mahomes got out of it. One time he threw it while, he was going down to the ground and he was able to get rid of it. That's that type of magic that Kansas City capitalizes on. But Denver threw everything in the kitchen sink at this Chiefs team last season. They should have won. They should have won on that game. But we saw Bo Nix step up a game-winning drive to put the team in a position to win. Special teams blunder cost them that. That would have changed the entire narrative about Bo Nix and the Broncos had he gone into Arrowhead and had the Broncos held on and won that game. There would be a lot more hype and there would be a lot more media attention, I think, around Bo Nix. But I think if the Broncos are going to knock off the Chiefs and win the AFC West, Denver has to do it by being better and switching those outcomes in one-score games. Instead of going 1-6, go 6-1 at that juncture. You have to do it. I know it's cliche to say it, but that's what they have to do. They have to be more efficient, more sustainable to be able to outlast a team like Kansas City who has that experience factor.
And it's not just going head to head against the Chiefs, is it? Right. It's making sure that you win those other games. Like, go ahead and beat all the teams that everybody says, oh, you beat bad teams. Who really cares what you did? That's what the Chiefs do every single year. They beat the teams that are put in their way. They just win. They find a way to win the games. It doesn't matter when you're representing the AFC in the Super Bowl that you beat the Raiders, who stunk, who fired their coach a couple of weeks later, and you beat the Raiders barely because they botched a snap on a game-winning drive by Aiden O'Connell. Like, that's the team that represented the AFC in the Super Bowl, is the same team that almost lost on a game-winning drive against Aiden O'Connell, Cody. And so I think that stuff doesn't matter. Like, who really cares? Who really cares who you beat on the way there? You have to win the games that are put in front of you. And the Broncos absolutely have to be better in one-score games. It's not just the Broncos have to be better against teams with winning records. Miss me with that kind of argument about, can you beat good teams? That really proves if you're good or not. The Broncos won 10 games last year with $90 million in dead cap, and they proved that they were much better than everybody thought they were. Better coached, better talent, better player development. They stayed healthy. They won a lot of games that most other teams were favored in. So to me, it's about winning those other games outside of just playing against Kansas City. Yes, you have to at least split with Kansas City, I think, in order to win the division. But man, you've got to win those other games. You've got to take care of business outside of Kansas City and those matchups that you have against them, because otherwise we know Kansas City's going to cause other teams to stumble. Kansas City's going to probably win 12, 13 games again. So you've got to find a way to win one more. Can you do that if you're Denver? Can you at least improve maybe by 2 or 3 games those one-score losses that you had last year? That's going to be critical to this team taking over the AFC West again. And I don't know, Cody, I think they've got the defense to do it. The question is, will the offense be able to step up and do their part?
I think that's going to be the most exciting dynamic of this entire upcoming season to follow. Can the offense stay healthy? I think the Broncos have loaded up on the offensive side of the ball. I think pieces defensively to where they are best positioned right now to reclaim stake to the AFC West throne that they've been searching for since Peyton Manning was the quarterback back in 2015. Broncos Country, let us know your thoughts on today's episode of the show, your thoughts on where the Broncos are positioned when compared to the Las Vegas Raiders, the Los Angeles Chargers, and the reigning and defending AFC West champions, the Kansas City Chiefs. How can the Broncos do that? Share your thoughts with us here on today's episode of the show. Thanks to all the everydayers out there. Broncos Country, we appreciate you so much. For all you everydayers out there, here's what you're going to get on tomorrow's episode of the show. We're going to go into the growing offensive identity of Bo Nix and the Broncos, and what going into year 2 in the system means for him with Sean Payton and all the pieces around him. We'll break that down and much more on tomorrow's episode, Locked On Broncos.